And we're now recording.
Welcome to our online symposium organized by the ACRL Digital Humanities Discussion Group co-conveners Laureen Paradise, John Russell, and Angela Driesen. Today's online symposium will feature 3 talks around the topic of digital humanities teaching in libraries and teaching digitally in pandemic times and thereafter. We will touch on topics of newly created systems, infrastructures, and programs which provide fundamental help in pandemic times, but may also be a key step into future services. Our speakers are Laura Braunstein from Dartmouth College, Janna Avon and Angela Perkins from Lafayette College, and Pamella Lach from San Diego State University. Our first speaker, Laura Braunstein, will speak on self-outreach, engaging students and faculty with digital humanities through remote teaching. And please start.
Oh, you're ready for me?
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
hang on.
Mm-hmm.
We get the right window. I have like 3 different monitors set up so I can see chat and I can see people and I can see my slides and the presenter notes. So hold on just a moment. I want to be able to see the chat while I'm talking. Move this here. Cool. Okay. So I'm Laura Braunstein. I'm the Digital Humanities Librarian and co-lead at Digital by Dartmouth Library at Dartmouth College. And I just want to, just as an acknowledgement to say that this is based on a presentation from NERComp last year. If anyone is not from the New England area, NERComp is the regional equivalent of EDUCAUSE. So it's an organization, and actually the virtual NERComp 21 is going on as we speak. I was at it this morning. That is an organization where academic IT professionals, librarians, and all sorts of people work together. So this interest in remote teaching is part of a longer project. And I'll sort of talk today about how we moved to remote during COVID times. Please do tweet if you like. DH people are notorious tweeters. I'm Laura Braunstein, if you haven't met me before. I've also included a shortened link to these slides, and feel free to paste that into the notes document or the chat and follow along. One thing I will notice as because this is part of a larger project, a lot of the consultation questions that I'm talking about, we have a kind of a larger document for that, and I've kind of put those at the end in an appendix to the slides. So I'm not going to go over those in detail today, but they may be really useful to you. The other thing is that when I sent this in, I said stealth outreach, and I really started to not like that term as much. And so I changed the title to subtle outreach. And ACRL folks and the organizers, I want to apologize that it was literally like an hour ago that I changed that. So, and I knew you wouldn't have time to change that. So in your materials. So I think that the implications of stealth, I started to not like, because I thought of, stealth bombing and things like that. And I like the idea of being subtle a little bit better. And also for those of you who have ever been at a presentation that I've given before, I'm actually really light on the memes this time. So this is one of 2 memes. The other one's at the end, and I hope it's going to be one that's really exciting for you as well. Okay, so one of the things I think that we're all finding is that the pivot to remote in COVID times happened at a time when probably we were all engaged with other initiatives. And one of the things we were doing at Dartmouth as a collaboration between the library and those of us involved in digital learning and our colleagues in IT, where we were thinking about the intake process for digital projects across the library and IT and in terms of our engagement with faculty. So how to make these projects collaborative and learning focused, learning outcomes focused, rather than like, how do I press the buttons on this particular platform? And so in the before times, what we often would hear faculty say to us is, hey, I want my students to do a cool digital project. And it was sort of haphazard the way they were coming to us. It was, hey, I know you, or like, I've heard of this platform and I heard there's somebody in the library or the IT learning designer group who works on this. Wouldn't it be cool if my students did this? And so we weren't really seeing a learning objective approach necessarily, where people were like, would say to us, I would like my students to learn how to communicate digitally. What is the best way to do that? Can we work together to develop it? And so really, we were trying to kind of change the narrative on that. In remote learning, it was almost as if they were saying some of the similar things, but in this time, instead of, hey, this will be cool, it was help. I need to make this in-person assignment into a digital project. And so what had been kind of thought of as extra and fun was now central and a necessity. But in each case, the questions we need to ask to make something digital, for me, these are the central questions of our field of digital humanities. What does it mean to be digital? What does it mean when we are digital, when we inhabit digital spaces? Whether that's deliberate or because of an emergency, right? A national and pedagogical emergency. What changes when we're digital? I think a lot of us were starting to look at the light at the end of the tunnel with vaccinations and returns to, quote unquote normal. So what's going to change when we come back? Who gets to be digital? So that's the question of access, right? And equity and inclusion. And what are digital things? What are these things we're making? Where do they go? Who gets to see them? How do we keep them? We tried to kind of take these requests and put them into the landscape that we currently had. We tried to think about what is available to us, to faculty, to librarians, to IT professionals, to students to make something digital. And so what are the digital resources we have? What are the platforms that we can offer? And we really tried to kind of dial back on this and say, okay, so we have certain platforms that we can support here at the institution for your teaching, for your pivot to remote. We have certain digital things that we can make in order to make these assignments work. And we have certain processes that we have in place that we have time and resources for. And I think, the human resources are the same that they always are, right? Time and trust. We want people to trust us, and we want to make sure that the people we're working with, we trust, that they trust our expertise, that the students will trust that we are there to help their learning. And I put resilience on there, but I also crossed it out because I'm really skeptical of the concept of resilience and how we're being asked to rely on resilience during a time when we have a lot of deficits in the things that we need to do our jobs. So we can maybe talk about that a little bit in the discussion. And so we've tried to, and I will also say too, when I say we, for this particular project, I mean me. There was a lot of help in a lot of these, but in some senses, we kind of, our collaborative project kind of got put on hold. And so what I'm really going to be talking about in particular is one particular class and one particular assignment. But I was trying to bring a lot of those questions back into that discussion. And actually, I'm really curious. I know we're going to have questions at the end, but could you all just throw into the chat how you define a digital project? I'm just curious to see what people come up with. And don't be shy. Just what do you think? What is a digital project to you? Okay, so we have anything that creates a digital artifact, a digital output, born digital objects, okay, online, uses a digital platform, a finite work, interesting, okay. Set definitions and goals, tools, something that yields a non-analog thing. Okay, this is great. Any project that takes twice as long as the faculty thinks it will, yes, fantastic. Okay, this is all fantastic. And so, it was so interesting because in some ways, in the before times, the folks who would come to us were often like, we were preaching to the choir, right? These were already the true believers. And now it was everyone. Because Dartmouth went to full, we were sort of lucky to be on the quarter system. So last March was our spring break, and then we started a new quarter. And then so spring quarter last year was fully remote for absolutely everyone. And so in some ways we kind of just, and then we had summer, fall and winter, and fall and winter had people on campus, but everything except for maybe 5 classes was fully remote still. Okay. And, the assignment design questions didn't change. What are the learning goals? Why do you want to do this? And if the answer was, well, I have to, the question, the pivot was to say, okay, well, what do you want them to learn? So let's get away, like, what would you have wanted to learn had everything been ideal back in, back when you were in the classroom? And again, for this whole section of the presentation, I've got a full appendix in the slides. You can scroll to the end if you want to right now, that show what the full kind of consultation session might look like. The other issue too is the end product. What do you want them to make? And who do you want the audience to be for this? And I think one thing that we find with a lot of faculty who have been teaching traditionally is this move from the students are making something for me to the students are making something potentially for the whole world is one that they have some trouble, I think, in some ways moving to if they haven't done digital scholarship before. And finally, thinking about what resources do we need? And this is the category of the consultation process where things are the most different from the before times, right? Because it has been so much harder in this process to have kind of pre-made or sort of like assignments in a box. Everything has to be bespoke in many ways because these are classes that we are trying to move completely digitally. So to talk about an example, I'm going to talk about a digital exhibit that I worked with the faculty and the students on this past winter term. And actually today is the first day of our spring term. So this was all done, and you'll get to see the final. Oh, I have 5 minutes left. Good Lord. Okay. So the course was called The Values of Medicine. It was a first-year seminar, and 16 students. They were all remote. It was an introduction to academic writing, approach to history of medicine, and it was a focus on pandemics through history, so very timely. And the class in the past had used primary sources and special collections to make an in-person exhibit. So instead, what we were going to do is do a digital exhibit focusing on epidemic disease at previous moments in history. The learning outcomes worked out with the faculty member and me and my colleague in special collections were writing for a public audience, writing for a digital audience, curating digital items, creating metadata, working collaboratively, and telling a compelling story. Using the digital exhibit platform was the last thing. This wasn't about it wasn't about pushing buttons. So this is an assignment that had been working in special collections before, so there was already a bibliography. We did a kind of fast digitization via iPad. We had our digital fellow work on creating metadata and sideloading them all into Omeka-S and organizing them into item sets. And that was all the pre-work. That was all the bespoke pre-work for the class. For teaching, I worked with the students for an introductory workshop, talked to them about what a digital exhibit was, had follow-ups with individual teams and students, consultations, they did peer review with each other, and then final presentations in the class. And so if you like, you can go see the final exhibit, the Values of Medicine. So we had 4 groups of 4 students all working together. There was one on the plague, one on hysteria, one on smallpox, and finally one on cholera. So what's next? We want to go back to, oh, and here's the meme. And I just heard the boat was refloated. So like, yay for the boat, right? So what's next? It's a lot of work to do. We have a community of practice that we want to continue. What do we want to take from what we have done in this emergency COVID situation? What documentation do we want to make available for faculty who are thinking about this and for students who need something to learn with? How are we going to outreach? How are we going to reach out to faculty who maybe didn't engage with this kind of assignment remotely while they had to pivot? And how do we make this sustainable so that in the future we can continue to do the things that have really brought us joy and a lot of learning in these assignments, but also make it so that we are not completely exhausted at the end of every term? And I think these are the same questions. What do we keep from this situation? What do we leave behind? And how has this changed us? And I think those are all questions that we continue to ask of our presence in digital environments. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. So, so bring them on.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. We move on to the next presenters. If you could stop sharing, great, fantastic. John, shall I do it? I do, but I can do it, okay. So our next two presenters are Janna and Angela Perkins from Lafayette College, talking about the Digital Humanities Summer School's Idea Incubator, developing programming on onboarding undergraduates into digital humanities research. And this is now your platform.
Great, thanks so much. Hi, my name is Janna Avon. I'm the Digital Initiatives Librarian at Lafayette College. I'm here with my colleague, Angela Perkins, who is one of our research and instruction librarians. And we are going to talk to you about a program that we piloted this past January called the Digital Humanities Summer Scholars Idea Incubator. Our overview for today, we're going to summarize our rationale and intentions. We'll talk a little bit about the Idea Incubator's structure and content, and we'll share a little bit about our successes and challenges in delivering the workshops and our development plan for future iterations of this program. Before we can get into that, though, we want to start by telling you a little bit about DHSS. And so I'll turn it over to Angela for that.
Hi, everyone. As Janna said, I'm Angela Perkins, Research and Instruction Librarian at Lafayette College, and I want to talk to you about a program that I direct called the Digital Humanities Summer Scholars Program. So I'm a librarian who specializes in DH and film and media, and it's a program geared to allow the undergraduate students at Lafayette to do original research and also to give them a little introduction into what is even digital humanities and how to do a DH project. A small cohort of about 7 to 8 students is chosen through an application process that is pretty selective for such a small cohort. Last year, 2020, 37 interviews were held and 8 summer scholars were chosen out of 31 applications. So the application process starts with a CFP, call for proposal. And in that call for proposal, we let the students know that they must interview before that they can apply to the program. And this is just to kind of assess where the student is at with their experience in research, and just to get an idea of what their ideas are. In the interview, they share their research interests with us, including any kind of project that they would want to work on in DHSS, and what they know or their experience to date with DH or digital scholarship. Sometimes I just ask them, what is their relationship to digital technology? Like, how do they use the digital in their everyday life? And after the interview, the student is invited to apply online. I have a Google form that I send them a link that they can then apply after the interview. And then I get together a committee of my colleagues and we decide. Basically, we review all the applications and we decide which are, I guess, strongest and create a cohort. And this is sort of where the idea for the Idea Incubator was born or started. So.
All right, so as Angela was saying, the Idea Incubator was developed in response to some patterns and common interests and challenges that we were seeing repeated across the pool of DHSS applications. So the most common reason that students were applying to DHSS were this strong desire to learn about the process of conducting research. Well, simultaneously, the biggest challenges that we were seeing with a lot of the applications were really underdeveloped ideas or a really underdeveloped sense of how they would accomplish their ideas. So because DHSS is really pretty intense and it's time limited, like it's a 6-week intensive, we find that the students who succeed the best in this program are the ones who have a really strong sense of their research project from the get-go. And so this gap between where we want the students to be at the beginning of the program and where a lot of these applications are is frequently a deciding factor in which students are accepted into the program. But of course, these gaps are also opportunities, right? So this common thread of interest suggests that we have some kind of a service gap around lower stakes opportunities to learn about research in kind of like a more self-directed way that's really kind of focused on here's the exact steps that we expect people to follow when they're going through like that kind of like really research methods oriented instruction. And we can also see potentially a service gap around developing some disciplinary awareness for digital humanities and research planning. So the idea incubator was developed to try to address these patterns and provide some lower stakes opportunities for students to come in and learn about these things. So our guiding questions in developing our themes of the workshops were, could we address this information desire in a lower stakes way for a broader audience? And can we address this development gap in the applications that we're seeing with supplementary programming?
Okay, so I just want to tell you a bit about the structure of the Idea Incubator. So it was a 4-part, 3-hour workshop series offered in January 2020 during a short term in between our fall and spring sessions called the interim. And they were Monday and Thursday for 2 weeks from 1 to 4 p.m. And so it began usually with a short lecture and then followed by some form of discussion of the topics and workshop time to work out the homework problems. Homework was given at the end of each session to be completed for the next. And so let me run through the sessions quickly. First session was Intro to Digital Humanities Scholarship. So basically we gave examples for them so that they would understand what DH or digital scholarship projects might look like. And again, homework. Second session was Intro to Thinking Like a Researcher. So this sort of addressed what we just mentioned about the fact that sometimes the students, although given evidence that they are interested in doing some form of research, they may not understand what it means to kind of implant themselves into the mindset of a researcher. Third session was about DH data and about learning how to think the problem. So it was a lot about research data management and just thinking about the ways in which data relates back to any sort of research that they want to do, including data collection, analysis, et cetera. And the fourth session was how to write a research pitch, a research proposal. So again, this was sort of addressing the issue of, some students are very interested in doing research or a research project, but they don't quite know how to talk about it yet. So that's what this session was addressing. And all of the workshop materials and so these were synchronous sessions, but there were also workshop materials available asynchronously in a Google Drive, Team Drive. So that was the basic form of the Idea Incubator.
Of course, just as I'm about to unmute, I have a bunch of motorcycles drive by my house, so I apologize for background noises. So let's talk a little bit about our successes and challenges. So we pulled this together pretty quickly. So we were talking about it in December as kind of like, maybe we should actually develop this as programming for January. Part of why is, as Angela mentioned, January is what we call our interim session. We had like this 3-week period that actually even got extended this year because we pushed back the start of our spring semester by a couple weeks. But typically our students are doing things like internships and travel abroad, study intensives and stuff like that all got canceled this year. So we're like, well, what can we offer that would maybe at least help them feel kind of engaged in their education while still being stuck at home and not able to do all the things they would normally do. So that put a little bit of a time crunch on us to kind of just put something together. Overall, we had a relatively strong interest from students. So our workshop had 10 registrants, and as we discussed, the DHSS only takes in 7 to 8 per year, and we had a little under 40 applicants this last year. And I mean, we're a small liberal arts college, so 10 students committing to something that they're doing voluntarily is pretty significant for us. So nearly every one of our students came from a different academic discipline. And we had students who were equally representing STEM as much as we had social sciences and the humanities. We also had an even distribution across all of our class cohorts. And what was also interesting was only half of the registrants were familiar with the DHSS program. So these were students who had no other contacts. They were just like, oh, this is a cool thing that's happening. This is the thing I'm interested in. I'm going to participate. So this demographic data really confirmed to us some of the assumptions that we've been making in putting together this project, this programming. So we have students across disciplines and at different stages of their academic careers that are interested in this kind of programming and learning these topics. There's a clear desire for interdisciplinarity on our campus. And digital humanities is a viable vehicle for exploring that. And some other successes, we saw a really tangible growth in our students' abilities to think through their ideas into a doable research project. So we had like our first session, we talked about what are you curious about, what are you interested in? And then the homework and each of the topics over the sessions was about massaging that general interest into an actual viable research project that they, if they wanted to pursue it, they could, but it was really about the exercise of learning how to make that development. And we saw it, we witnessed it, it worked. And we had great feedback from the students about enjoying the experience and the things that they got to learn, which was pretty great. So overall, it felt really successful. And in addition to that, the materials that we developed for the incubator have actually already been recycled. So we've used them in other contexts. So in other classes that we've assisted with in this term, we've shared it out with students who have expressed their interest in DHSS for this coming year. So there's been a lot of value to having developed these. The challenges, of course, are the challenges that we would have expected. Our students, some of them had less reliable internet connections. Many of them had personal obligations at home, as well as personal emergencies and other things that got in the way of them joining our synchronous sessions. And these things did prove to be barriers to access for some of the content as well. 3 hours is a really long time, even though we scheduled a break every hour. That was always a minimum of 15 minutes. Like it's still a lot. It's a long time. And it's particularly challenging for the lecture portion of it. So we tried to keep the lecture to an hour. But an hour listening to somebody is challenging when you're doing it over Zoom. It's hard to remain actively engaged in that. And then, of course, some of the other things, like some of our activities didn't necessarily hit the way we wanted them to. So like our pitching activity, which we were going to do for the last hour of the last session, that was just like the students just did not have enough time to feel prepared and engaged with that. So that would be something that we would want to like rethink and redo in a different way next time, which leads us to our discussion about our future development.
Yeah, so there's a few different ways, including what you just mentioned about trying to find different ways to structure the sessions is probably, top of mind, especially because we would like to do this again. And I'm personally hoping we can do it again annually, just every year. I think it's something, first of all, really beneficial to all Lafayette students, not just those who are interested in joining the DHSS program, but also, more granularly to those students who are going to become summer scholars and really want to, drop in as quickly as possible into the research mindset and also start familiarizing themselves with what DH even means, and that is one of the pieces of future development that I think is super important. I plan to, so I just finished the application process for 2021 on Friday. And I'm hoping that after choosing this 2021 cohort, I'm gonna kind of pass them through the incubator at the end of the spring semester. So we start again, DHSS starts again May 31st. And I'm hoping to have the incubator like maybe a month, before we start, so that they can, a lot of students, once they get in, they're like, when should I be working on my project? I'm like, all the time. You should be thinking about your topic all the time, and, planning your making your project plan, which we do in the DHSS, start outlining early. And this provides a nice formal way for students to start doing that, to start formally thinking about how they're going to execute their project. And then, a couple of other things we thought of were developing partnerships with other campus bodies. So there are a lot of, I know that Janna and I are both interested in interdepartmental communication, and we would like to do that, to include others who will be able to help not only us, obviously, but the students to pursue this particular type of research. And it would be great if the incubator was a conduit for that. And then decide, and it being a COVID year, it's very much top of mind. Is this something that would be able to continue in an in-person mode, or does it seem to be something that works best on a remote, basis inside of Zoom? And that's something that we will think about.
Yeah, I do want to add, like, part of the reason why I think this was successful is because it was offered digitally this year. So our students are typically not on campus during the interim session. They're also typically not on campus over the summer. And during our regular academic years, they would not have these kinds of time blocks available to them to work on independent projects in this way. So in terms of being able to access our students when they have time and where they're available, the digital did really, really serve us. And our campus isn't one that has a tradition of remote instruction. So it opened a new vehicle for us for providing library programming and services, which I'm hoping we'll be able to continue to explore in the future. And those were my final thoughts. Do you have any other final thoughts, Angela?
No, just, thank you for listening to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your attention, and we look forward to your questions.
I had problems with my microphone, sorry. Thanks a lot for your interesting presentation. And we will have questions at the end and move on to our third speaker, who is Pamella Lach from San Diego State University. And she is speaking about Space Still Matters, advocating for dedicated digital humanities library spaces in a virtual world.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm hoping I can keep my video on throughout this talk. I'm having a little bit of problem with my Wi-Fi, so we'll see how this goes. Well, as Angela said, my name is Pam Lach. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the digital humanities librarian here at San Diego State University, which occupies the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay. I direct our Digital Humanities Center in the library, and I co-direct our Digital Humanities Initiative, which is a campus-wide initiative. And as Angela said, I'm here to talk about the importance of space, particularly DH library space, even and in an ongoing pandemic and a post-pandemic world. And I have a set of questions that I'm going to pose today with partial and incomplete answers and sort of starting places. But these are the questions that are guiding my own thinking about how to keep the DH Center running, both virtually now and in some other format when we go back to in-person, in theory, in the fall. So how do we as digital humanities library folks advocate for the creation and ongoing growth of dedicated library spaces now and after the pandemic? And how do we continue to demonstrate the importance of physical spaces, even as we support and grow virtual services? So I'm going to use the Digital Humanities Center at San Diego State as a sort of case into exploring these questions. And I'm really interested to hear what other folks are thinking about. Some of you might have spaces like this in your library. Some of you might be planning spaces that the planning of which got disrupted by the pandemic. So just really briefly, San Diego State University is part of the California State University system, which is the largest public university system in the country. We are a Hispanic serving institution, practically on the border with Mexico, and we're an R2 with R1 aspirations. And our Digital Humanities Initiative has existed long before my arrival in fall 2016 as the DH librarian. It's a grassroots, bottom-up, faculty-led group of folks who are interested in critical digital inquiry and in centering humans and the importance of human interactions in the digital age, with a special particular attention to anti-racist, social justice, and global diversity work. When I arrived in fall of 2016, I started gathering people together to begin visioning work for the Digital Humanities Center, which isn't just community driven, but values driven. So those values that I just articulated really went into the design of the space. And this is a time-lapse video of our last face-to-face showcase. I'm gonna actually turn off my video. I'm getting a unstable connection message. Okay, and I designed the space in an iterative way so that when we launched it in late 2017, early 2018, it was incomplete. It was still somewhat of a blank slate, and you can maybe get a sense of that here. And over the course of the years, we engaged in the programmatic maturation and growth that you'd expect, but that was uneven growth. So we formalized our programmatic services, our pedagogical partnerships, a staffing model which has fluctuated over the years. In fact, I've had sort of somewhat of a revolving door of staff coming through the center, in part because of the low salaries at San Diego State for staff. The thing that I was really focused on in the last year or so, leading up to the pandemic, was building out some of the spaces, including digital studios for critical inquiry connected to particular growth areas in the curriculum, such as electronic literature, VR and 3D animation production, as well as podcasting. And then the two images at the very top are a sort of flexible, informal learning space where I was teaching a lot of workshops, but where faculty were coming in with their students to engage, to experiment with their pedagogy in different ways, whether it was a showcase, like a virtual poster session, which you see on the left, or this JMS professor, Nate Rodriguez, on the right, who would come in once a week with his class in the beginning of the spring 2020 semester to really experiment with his pedagogy in ways that he couldn't in his assigned classroom. And then with the pandemic, like so many other folks, we shut everything down. We figured out pretty quickly that we were going to have to virtualize our operations. So I canceled all of our activities and created some new activities that were born virtual in the Zoom space. So we could experiment with how to teach a tools workshop over Zoom. I'd never done that before. And we could experiment with other kinds of things based on what our community was asking for, or had the appetite for. And that was a prelude to a full year of virtualization this year. We knew by the end of the semester that the entire CSU would largely be remote. And so we knew that we'd be operating virtually at least through the end of this semester. And we know as well that the fall semester will be predominantly in person, though what the predominant means is a little squishy. And over the course of both the spring and then this year, we sort of formalized these virtual operations with a focus on working less and caring more. So we tried, rather than trying to be everything to everybody, we tried to focus on the needs of our community. And we tried to really focus on the things that, rather than create more work for people who were already maxed out, that we could just focus on highlighting and showcasing our existing expertise, building a network of that expertise that could help other faculty through our Teaching During Quarantine website. And a big shout out to Cassie Tanks, who I believe is in the room right now, developing these digital tool tutorials for our student assistants to create. So it's a project where students become an expert in a tool and then create tutorials for helping other students learn how to use those tools, the very peer-to-peer kind of model. And then we also engaged in virtual institutes for podcasting with the National Humanities Center for doctoral students. We had 26 students over the summer, 95 students this winter over 2 different weeks. And so we really became more and more adept at delivering virtualized operations, as well as engaging in the kind of virtual instruction that we've already heard about from our other presenters. But there were things we couldn't do, of course. We couldn't provide access to those specialized digital studios. There hasn't been much, if any, demand during the pandemic, but I'm not entirely sure what to expect next year. And that showcase that I showed the video of from 2019, we decided we couldn't do that in a virtual world. That is, part of the showcase was to celebrate the digital work going on across the campus and particularly among our students in the classes. But it was also a celebration of the space itself. And we just felt like we couldn't do it in Zoom, and that it was not appropriate, it was unethical to ask people to take on more work to engage in a showcase that just wasn't going to be the same. So my co-director, Jessica Pressman, and I wrote a statement about why we were intentionally canceling the showcase and why we decided that it just wouldn't work. So where does that leave us now? We're planning for an uncertain future. For just about the beginning of the pandemic, I knew that transformational change was going to be necessary for a post-pandemic world. But I'm still not quite sure what that means. The campus reopening plan is shifting daily just about, which affects the library reopening plan. We've only just begun to plan for that, but we know the library will reopen in the fall. I don't yet know what that means for the Digital Humanities Center, but I do know that I'm keeping my operations virtual at least through the fall, because we don't yet know when this pandemic will come to a conclusion, when we'll have herd immunity. Particularly because the campus cannot require students to be vaccinated while the vaccine is only under emergency use authorization. We know that there are going to be long-term budget constraints, even though SDSU's enrollment is up, and even though the California state budget is performed way better than expected at the beginning of the pandemic. I know that I will have long-term staffing and capacity limitations. I was trying to fill 2 staff lines this time last year. We were in the middle of application review when there was a hiring chill announced across the CSU. And I still have not gotten final word on whether I can fill one or both of the positions and whether I can even retain both of the positions. But my assumption is not. And we know that we have to plan for future resilience. There's going to be more and more crises. In the last year, not only have we had a pandemic here in California, but we've had wildfires. We've seen other kinds of environmental disasters as the result of global of climate change. We expect, increasing or more social unrest and potentially another pandemic in our lifetime, though it's hard to even imagine that when we're still living in this one. But what I do know is that despite our very successful virtualization, and in fact, our virtual events attracted, in some cases, more people than our face-to-face events, I continue to maintain that space matters, that there's something irreplaceable in bringing people together to explore, to create, and to critique the digital. But where I'm struggling is with this delicate balancing act. So there are things we can't do without the space, but we have limited capacity for managing it. And right now I'm down to a shared position with our makerspace. So I have a half-time temporary person this year with the hope of filling a full-time position in the DH Center next year, but I still don't know. Virtualization of our programs, services, and partnerships will have to continue, but I worry that that makes us vulnerable to space grabs, or perhaps to losing the space completely. And I don't worry about that within the library, but externally, that if someone outside of the library sees a space that they perceive to be underutilized, even while we're still socially distancing, that they might try to grab it as an alternative learning space or something else. And then for me, the question is, let's say I open my doors in the fall, and it's maybe just a study space because my operations are virtually. is it still a DH center? And what is it if not? So again, my questions: how do we advocate for the creation and ongoing growth of dedicated library spaces now and after the pandemic? And how do we continue to demonstrate the importance of those spaces, even as we support and grow virtual services? So I don't have complete answers, but I have some starting places. And these are strategies that are not really that unfamiliar to the kinds of strategies many of us are used to already. But for one, it's important to be explicit about what we can and can't do virtually, and to use the importance of space to argue for resources supported by data, testimonials, and storytelling from our community of users. It's important to manage expectations, particularly about post-pandemic operations. So for me, I need to scale down and focus on doing less with greater impact, rather than giving into this urge to do more and more with less and less, which I'm sure a lot of us are feeling right now. I know that I need to somehow build and update the space for future resilience through virtualization and hybridization to expand access, but I'm concerned about the invisible labor and other costs and losses to doing that. And as I've argued in other places, using the core values of the DH community here on campus for that decision-making and advocacy, and using those values to balance against this shifting landscape, to reconceptualize what's possible and to hopefully fix what wasn't working before the pandemic. So again, this is just a starting point, and I'm really curious to hear what folks in the Zoom room have to say. And I hope that we can start the conversation today and keep it going offline or on Twitter or somewhere else as well. So thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure to share this with y'all.
Yeah, thanks a lot for all your presentations. As we are now coming to our discussion part, I'm passing on the word to John.
Okay. So we have a few questions. I guess I'll start. This is for Laura. How do you see this kind of work scaling at your library? For instance, what would happen if you suddenly had 10 faculty members asking for similar support?
It will not scale. And if 10 people asked, I'm the only person working on Omeka exhibits right now, and I have said over and over again that this will not scale, and that the best thing that we can do right now is take the experiences that we've had and use the time over the summer, the magical summer when everyone gets all of their other projects done, to put together some documentation and also to train a few extra people to support these courses. Yeah, this doesn't scale.
I'm going to turn to a question that just came into the chat for Pam. With what looks like a large space at your institution, does it feel lived in? Is that a goal for your management of the space in the midterm with limited resources?
That's a great question. It's a huge space, and with my limited staff, it's very hard to maintain. Pre-pandemic, it did feel lived in that there was a lot of activity going on there, both students coming in to study and work on collaborative projects, as well as a lot of face-to-face activities and events. What's interesting about this is I have a new dean who interviewed during the pandemic and has never seen the DH Center in action in person. So it's very unclear to me what the expectations are for the space when we reopen. But one of the issues that we were struggling with before the pandemic was the CSU mandates that every library provide a certain percentage of seating based on the number of enrolled students, and we are under that percentage. And so there's always this push to have more and more study space. And we had made an agreement with the library, with library administration before the pandemic, that while the DH Center is open 10 to 4 Monday through Friday, Monday through Thursday, we would sort of convert it just to general study space as long as the building was open, which back then was till midnight, so that there was enough seating for students, with the exception of when there was a DH event going on. So we were already trying to balance that sort of lived in feeling with the the sort of coherence and programmatic focus of being DH. And I was already struggling with that a little bit. I will also just say that we're located in the bottom level, sort of tucked away from other parts of the library. And so the students who do come into the DH Center like it because it is a little off the beaten track, and they don't want other people to know about it because they can always find a comfy spot to work. And they really like that. So it's sort of a well-kept secret among the students.
Great, thanks. I'm going to ask a question to Janna and Angela. Did you find that the idea incubator helped with scope creep or with overly ambitious projects in relation to the time needed to create the project?
Well, yeah, I saw that question, and yeah, I think that it does. I mean, in so much as you know, we were doing the idea incubator in order to give these students, you know, just an initial place to think about their project. You know, I think I would have to follow up and interview some of the students to see if they understood and revised and edited their idea in order to fit. But the incubator also wasn't, you know, totally geared to students who were interested in DHSS. It was everyone. So that's also something else that kind of affected that as well.
I will say actually that was one of the things that we were teaching the students over the course of the workshops, was how to scope and how to pull back and how to hone in on their ideas. So how it was structured was that each of the homework assignments was kind of like a further refinement of their idea. And part of what the workshop was actually having a group discussion with everybody going, okay, well, where are you at with this project? What's coming up? What are you thinking? And then everybody kind of like giving feedback and critique on it. And so a lot of our sessions were, okay, well, that's a really big idea. What are ways in which we can break this down and make it smaller and pull it in and think about what resources are available to support this as a viable research project instead of as kind of like a big thing, or how are ways that you can scale it, or ways that you could pilot it and then, you know, grow over time with this idea if you wanted to build out. So that was definitely like one of the lessons we were trying to impart with the group.
Yeah, I think it's hard for me to even describe because it was inherent in the idea, you know, and it's just something I'm always trying to do with students, is to, you know, manage the scope of their ideas, you know.
Great, thank you. We have another question for Laura. Can you elaborate on the bibliography that you mentioned you prepared before the class? What was the content of it, and kind of what was the purpose of it? Like, how was it designed to help the students, or did it have some other purpose?
Yeah, I'm pasting in the link in the chat. It's a link to the exhibit again. And what it was actually, it was the set of materials and special collections that Jay Satterfield, my colleague, who's the special collections librarian, had used with this professor before. So essentially what had happened in previous years is the students had all come into special collections. All of these materials have been pulled for them to look at as part of the class. And then they made physical exhibits out of them, just using sort of the classroom and special collections. And so these are the materials that were all sort of on the fly digitized with a phone or iPad before the class. So this was sort of like the primary source textbook for the class. The students kind of put together their own bibliographies. And if you look at the exhibit in Omeka, you can see under each themed exhibit that there is a browse, you know, smallpox collection, and those are the items that we prepared for them. The students did add some of their items and didn't always take the metadata lesson to heart. So we do have a bunch of things that are just untitled in there. This is something I see over and over again with student exhibits. So it's one of the things sort of during these times, I'm really taking Pam's idea of work less, care more to heart here. And I think that's sort of our approach to this project, was that they got the idea. And I think they did a great job, even if everything wasn't perfect.
Great, thanks, Laura. We've got about 5 minutes left. I want to pose a question to Pam that's a little bit of a follow-up to her answer to her previous question. You mentioned you have a new library director. Have you had an opportunity to try and promote your space? You're mentioning a lot of practical examples of how to tell the story of your space. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience doing that with a new director, and maybe some of the things, maybe feedback that you got from this person that lets you know, like, oh, this kind of work, they wanted to hear more about this, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really fortunate that the new library dean is very supportive of digital humanities and its place in the library and digital scholarship more broadly, and has some experience with these kinds of spaces in other library environments. But yeah, it's been an interesting thing because I've shared annual reports with him, and I've shared feedback from some of our participants, and I've shared some of the data with him, and he's very positive about all that. But we haven't yet had a chance to engage in that kind of conversation about, like, what do I envision for the space? What does he envision for the space? So I don't yet know. I don't know if he has a particular vision beyond wanting to align digital services in the library a little bit more than they are right now. So I don't do much with the makerspace. I'm not involved in digitization. We're all kind of disparate islands in the library, and I think he would like to see some alignment. But I don't think that we haven't really had much of a conversation about sort of that bigger picture, other than he came to our DH advisory board meeting a couple of weeks ago. It might have been longer than that. Time is irrelevant now. But he got to see the community in action and see the relationships that we had built over the years and why that's so central to the community. And I think he's starting to get a more complete picture. What that means for next year, I'm not sure yet, because we don't have enough information yet about the library reopening to even begin to venture into what does this mean for DH in the short term versus what does this mean in the long term. But I will say that he's very supportive and receptive to ideas, and has many of his own ideas as well. So I'll have to report back on that maybe in 6 months' time.
Great, thank you. Last question, and it's going to go to Laura. And I'm curious what you can do with this. Do you have any advice on working with faculty who have panicked, asked for a quick turnaround instruction, advice about making the pre-working consultation process that you've outlined less developed than it normally would be? Basically, what do you do for somebody who's like, I want to do this, but I want to do it like tomorrow, in a couple of weeks?
So, here I think about like a decade and a half of being a reference librarian, and that there's always something we can do for somebody, even if their research papers due like in an hour. And just to say, so we can't do a full-blown, digital, maybe I would say to this person, here's a script. We can't do this full-blown exhibit project with you, because that takes, a good month lead time to get everything together. But how about if I come into the class and we talk a little bit about, community archiving on the web? And look at some projects. Or what is your class about? Oh, it's about it's 19th century literature. Well, let's look at this Twitter thread of how people have engaged in this meme where they rewrite the opening lines of famous 19th century novels, but they're about the Ever Given, which is really funny if you take a look. I mean, like, always, like having a kind of in your back pocket sort of these small things that you could do. Is your think about it's always the learning objectives of the class. Is it a creative writing class? Is it an anthro class? Is it a chemistry class? Not those people wouldn't come to me necessarily, but just to think about what are ways in which that we could connect with them and try and think about, what does it mean to be digital in your profession, in your field, and what are ways that we can engage with students, even for a half an hour discussion and a show and tell, and for them to share a few things that get them excited. And I think that, that's just a way to connect and to show them that that we can find a way to accommodate what they need, even if it's not sort of the full court press of what we would bring to something with more preparation.
Great, thank you. I realize that even though I'm the timekeeper, my clock is a little bit behind and we are out of time. It is now 1 o'clock. So thank you again to all of our presenters, and thank you everybody for being here. I appreciate you spending your Monday afternoon with us, or Monday morning as it may be.